Let me try this one here. I was saying thank you very much, distinguished moderator, for giving me the floor.
The interpreters are asking that you speak very close to your mic, or maybe raise your voice, sir.
Good.
Okay.
All right, let me do
Okay, sit down. Yes.
Let me do the two things. Sit down and then raise my voice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the floor. Executive Secretary, Professor Nandose, Excellency Commissioner for Human Resources, Science and Technology of the African Union Commission, the Deputy Executive Secretary for the ECA, all good friends, the distinguished panel of experts that ACBF has lined up for this conversation, and I wouldn't go to the names, and moderator, your own true self, true African, Daniel, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. As you heard in the introductory statement of the Executive Secretary, he wanted very much for this conversation to be a tic-tac conversation, which means going to the point, raising up issues, and looking critically at what the ACBF has aptly named the capacity imperatives for delivering on an agenda as important as the vision laid out by the African Union, Agenda 2063. If you don't remember the Agenda 2063 because there are too many figures, just say the Africa we want. That's what Agenda 2063 is all about, the Africa we want. 50 years from now, but beginning 10 years at a time. Let me just take you through a number of thoughts to stimulate the discussion and introduce the context within which this stimulation is coming. It's 50 years since most of the African countries gained independence, and we now realize that African countries have made remarkable, truly remarkable economic growth. We also know that the continental organization, the African Union, born from the OAU, has carpentered a vision that should drive Africa, a vision that has been carpentered by the heads of states, which seeks to achieve an integrated, a prosperous, and a peaceful Africa driven by its own citizens. And you heard here the remarks of the commissioner when he emphasized the ownership and ability to drive our own development. And an Africa representing a dynamic force in the global arena. Let's move on. Capacity is a complex issue, and nobody knows better than the ACBF, the ECA, the NEPAD, all these organizations that have been focusing on it, and ACBF in particular, given its mandate for capacity in the continent. It touches on the institutions and organizations. We know we have weak capacity in a number of areas, and that constitutes a perennial challenge. We also know now that going forward towards the vision of 2063, capacity development is critical. Let's move on. Let me just take you to the background. In some conversations involving the chairperson of the AUC and the executive secretary of the ACBF, the issue of what can be done to look at the capacity requirements for delivering on Agenda 2063 came up. And it was decided that as early as now, there would be a serious look at the state of capacities and that look will enable us to prepare a capacity development plan, and that the ACBF will lead the work on assessing the current state of capacities and also preparing an initial development plan. And the ACBF, with the support of the AUC, then put together a team of senior advisors and experts on capacity issues from the many that we have in the continent to start work. And I'm pleased to indicate that sitting in the room today, some of the members of this team are Dr. Hesfina Rukato, who's down somewhere, if you can put up your hand, Professor Ewang, whose hand is up somewhere here, Brian Kagoro, and a number of others who are not here today. But this team, working under the auspices of the ACBF and the AUC, is tasked with undertaking a capacity assessment and preparing an initial capacity development plan. Let's move on. I'm wondering why my colleagues chose a color which cannot be readily seen. I hope you, on this screen in particular, but I hope on the other screens you are able to see what is up there. The purpose of the exercise, which I've just talked about, is to first develop a capacity needs assessment framework tailored to the needs of Agenda 2063, to undertake an assessment of the current state of capacities, define the scope, look at the institutions, the organizations, and identify the institutional arrangements that are in place or not in place or are needed for delivering on Agenda 2063, and eventually prepare a capacity development plan. Let's move on. I realize I have to go much quicker. The scope of the study which is being undertaken involves contact and discussions initially with the AUC and its organs, with key institutions like the NEPAD and the African Parliament and the APRM, and importantly, the regional economic communities. And in a subsequent phase, at the national level, the key institutions and key stakeholders, and not to forget the stakeholder groups within the private sector, the youth and women, as well as the academia and think tanks. Let's move on. There are several ways of looking at capacity. Most of you have heard all of us who are working in capacity say this, that when you want to address the issue of capacity, you are trying to put your hands around an elephant. And your hands cannot really go around an elephant. So you end up touching one small part. And you say, I have it. And that's the challenge. So we then want to say, in looking at the situation in terms of the capacity needs, what are some of the entry points? And these entry points, you will realize, are not exclusive, but they give a starting point that delimit the work that can be done and then spread it out. Let's move on. First, the issue of how you frame capacity in the context of Agenda 2063. A key point to remember, a key point to praise the wisdom of the African Union and the support of the ACBF on this initiative is that when the Lagos Plan of Action was adopted, there was no investment in worrying at that time on what will be the capacity required to deliver on the Lagos Plan, subsequently the Abuja Treaty. And so for this new vision, as early as now, the decision has been made to look at the nature of capacity that will be required at all levels to deliver on what essentially is a transformative agenda. And so we start with the question, capacities for what? What is it that has to be delivered within Agenda 2063 for which we need to assess or to build or to strengthen capacities? We then look at the issue of the institutional architecture. What are the institutions that are there that are supposed to play active roles in delivering or helping in the delivery of this? How do they work? Are there duplicative approaches? Is there clarity of mandates? How is the complementarity of work done at the continental level through those institutions and at the sub-regional level through the important regional economic commissions? And how does that link to where the action really takes place in the national level? Then we also thought that we need to take a look at the transformative and change management capacities that are required for a transformative agenda, and that we need to develop a better understanding of the soft and the hard capacities that are required. And finally, that one has to find a way of focusing on youth and women as the center pillars for delivery of Agenda 2063. Let's move on. And on the issue of the youth, the initial thinking, and it will be very good to see the inputs that come from this meeting, the issue of how you reinvent education so that the youth that are being trained in an education that caters to the demands coming from the labor market. And you heard again the comments from the commissioner when he talked about the demand side of the equation, and how you center stage the role of the youth, knowing that those who are 10 years old today are in fact the people to start talking to about the Agenda 2063. And how you instill a sense of ownership in today's youth to take over and play a key part, and a spirit of African self-confidence, and what kinds of mechanisms need to be developed, proper mechanisms catering to the role of youth, and not youth participating in mechanisms developed as have been the case now only. Let's move on. And similarly, making Agenda 2063 work for women, but in the sense that women and youth become the pillars, because put those two together, you have more than 70% of the populations of any country, but it's not just numbers. You have more than 70% of the energy of any country. It's not just energy. You have more than 70% of the capacity of any country when you put those two pillars together. And the similar things that we talked about the youth again, what you do to center stage and what you do to create specific mechanisms different from those that may have been experimented so far. Let's move on. And then we come to the question of when you look at capacity for what, and you take a peek at the Agenda 2063, you will notice when you read the documents that there are about 12 areas of priority that have been identified, very important, relevant areas: socioeconomic development, agriculture, women, infrastructure, youth, and so on. And then there are flagship projects, about 10, that have been given by way of example. And those flagship projects are in the middle. There you hear talk about the integrated high-speed train network. You hear mention about the Great Inga Dam, determination to silence the guns, no conflicts, no shooting, no dying from shooting by 2020. The creation of an African annual forum bringing all stakeholder groups together to plan and strategize differently. The issue of commodities, the issue of establishing the continental financial institutions, establishing a continental free trade area, a single African aviation market, dealing with the issues of outer space, the Pan-African e-network, establishments of a virtual university, free movement of persons, and the African passport. And some of these have deadlines that have been. And so what we begin to do is to say, if these are some of the early flagship programs, let's take a look on the right-hand side at the nature of technical capacities that will be required to deliver on those. And I won't go through the list, but you can look through an impressive list of the technical, critical hard skills you need. And on the left side, the soft skills that you need. And you wouldn't achieve any of these programs without combining in the appropriate way the hard and soft skills. And the soft skills, again, relate to political will, strong commitment of leadership and everybody, mindset change, self-confidence, strong engagement, a Pan-Africanist spirit and approach, proactivity, result orientation, sense of energy in the way we work, and so on. So you will see for each project a combination of soft skills and hard skills are required to achieve. Let's move on. At this stage, I'm looking at my watch. The moderator is very kind with me, so I need to move before he calls me to order shortly. So we said it will also be interesting to look at a range of additional capacity sets, if one could play around with that word. You look at the initial capacity set, the 4 dimensions of capacity that one normally would examine in any situation, the institutional capacity setup, the human capacity of that setup, the systems and processes that are used, because systems can either be capacity enabling or disenabling. And then the access to knowledge, access to information, which again is such an important capacity enabling or disenabling consideration. And I wouldn't go through that, but those are some of the things that we are looking at in terms of how we bring that to play in the assessment and in the determination of capacities. Let's move on. That's just an elaboration of the capacity set 1, what I mentioned, the institutional capacity, the human capacity on the right, the information and access to knowledge, and then systems and work processes. The modus operandi of organizations. Does it allow them to do things effectively, speedily? Let's move on. And then we say, if you look at a capacity set that we call set 2, we need to begin to identify what is it that makes people change. We need to begin to say, are there transformative capacities that we need to bring out and milk? And if they are not, can we train for them? Can we just assume that people will want to be transformative because they were born willing to be transformative? Are Africans, where we are, sufficiently oriented towards transformation and change? Are we capable of changing our mindsets radically in line with the vision of an agenda as bold as 2063? Questions that we need to ask. Let's move on. We sort of plotted that out in, again, as an exercise to exercise our thinking. We're plotting that out, but I wouldn't go into that to take your time. Let's move on. And then we say there's a capacity set 3 that you also need to look at, what we call composite capacities. Those things that you don't get taught in a direct way at schools necessarily because they are not necessarily constructed as discipline areas that gives you a degree. Something like strategic planning. You may have a PhD or a master's in agriculture or in infrastructure, and you are a good agriculturist and infrastructure specialist. But then you are given a responsibility in a ministry or in a department or organization, and suddenly you realize you have to strategic plan. But you remember that you didn't really spend that much time in school to be trained in strategic thinking and strategic planning because you were focusing in getting your PhD in agriculture. So we say a lot of these capacities that we assume are there simply because a person has been trained in something else, and then we realize that when you are responsibilized in an organization to deliver, we then say, does the person have enough strategic planning abilities as the director or as the chief of unit? Does he have, she have critical strategic thinking abilities? Can the person facilitate processes? Can the person coordinate? Can the person handle organizational responsibilities? So the disciplines that we concentrate on learning are good, but the educational systems are not concentrating enough on giving us the tools handling these composite capacities that you suddenly are faced with in the working world. Let's move on. And then we say finally here that whatever you say, you have to say we need and must have in sufficient numbers people in critical skill technical areas. If we are going to be as transformative with this agenda, do we have enough science and technology experts? What do we do in a skills revolution to get them? Do we have enough engineers in most of the fields? Do we have mining experts and we want to own the exploitation of our mines? Do we have experts that can play roles in the whole gamut of mining operations? And how do we train for these people immediately, as from yesterday, so that we can own the management of our own resources in 5 years' time within the first 10 years of this program and so on? Do we have enough infrastructure experts to build our own high-speed train from Durban to Cairo, whether it be the specialists or the laborers, without having to rely on these specialties coming from outside? If so, if we don't, what do we do to work towards that? Health specialists, research institutions, water resource, IT and communication, do we have enough? So technical skills, again, when you look at the boldness of the agenda, you say, we really have to invest in producing in sufficient quantities these people. And then we move on, and I will be wrapping this soon. Let's move on. That one will have a capacity assessment framework. Stay with the framework for a minute, Munay. Yeah. That is looking at these issues, which also takes into account the capacity development strategic framework that the African Union and NEPAD had evolved for the continent with support from key institutions like the ECA, the UNDP, and many other organizations. And that capacity development strategic framework, which has been adopted, highlights the importance of leadership transformation, the importance of citizenship transformation, the importance of knowledge and innovation, utilizing skills and resources, and unlocking the African potential, and developing the capacity of capacity builders. You know, most of our schools who are involved in training, they probably need to have their capacity updated to deal with the kinds of issues that the continent is facing and that the market is requiring. And so these things have been highlighted in the strategic framework, and we need to also see how we bring them up highly at this stage. Let's move on. And so, by way of conclusion, if an assessment is done, if all these things are looked at, we then begin to say, how do you do an initial capacity development plan, at least to cater for the first 10 years of implementation? And we are saying, and again, your guidance and inputs on that, we're saying you cannot really do a capacity development plan for a full 10 years and be complete, or let alone for 50 years. You take it in little chunks. You choose a critical path approach where you decide and identify some foundational elements and invest in strengthening capacity on those, knowing that if you do so, after the first 5 years, you can then identify a whole range of things to do, and so on and so forth throughout the decades of implementation. And that such a plan then will build on what would have been discovered in the assessment and provide an opportunity for investments to begin to strengthen and build capacities at all levels, at various stakeholder group levels, to allow for implementation of the agenda. Munai, should I assume we're almost at the end of this slide? Let me now go into methodology. Move on, let's see. These are the category of important documentation that has been identified, needs to be brought together and assessed and used for this exercise, and I wouldn't go into that. These are the key institutions that are going to be engaged initially at in this conversation, in addition to later on the member states. You see the African Union Commission itself, again, where lots of discussions are already going on in terms of the role of the African Union in the implementation of Agenda 2063, the policy organs, the AU Assembly, the Executive Council, the Permanent Representatives Committee of Ambassadors, the Peace and Security Council, the ECOSOC, and the NEPAD Heads of State and Governments Orientation Committee, specialized agencies, NEPAD, institutions like the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, the Pan-African Parliament, and so on.
30 seconds left, sir.
And these are the groups that we're going to be trying to converse and learn from and begin to assess what might be required. I heard a whisper from the moderator, and at that point, before he says anything loud, I want to say thank you so much for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nyambi, and for that comprehensive report. I'm sure some of the panelists who have had some information to work with, and also maybe to try and see whether there's any embellishment that's needed, or as it stands, you have now done all the work with all your other people that you're working with. I think what we'll do now is get into the discussion. As I said earlier, we'll stay with the panelists for a while, and then we'll have an open discussion. I'm glad the Executive Secretary of the African Capacity Building Foundation, Professor Nadozi, says that this is a no-holds-barred sort of a discussion, so let's have it as such. Let's have that discussion, an honest discussion. And with that spirit in mind, I'd want to start with you, Dr. Handok, and say, you agree with what you have seen? Do you have any additions to make? And whilst you are thinking about that, I just want you to think on whether there's anything new about Agenda 2063.
Thank you very much, my friend Daniel, and let me start by thanking SCBF for this invitation, for organizing this very important study and workshop to deliberate and discuss on this. I think we can already begin to see, I would like to believe, a new SCBF under the able leadership of my friend Professor Nandoni, and with the type of studies and contributions like this, we are promised an excellent contribution from SCBF. Maybe I will have probably I'll have 4 points. Number one, I think we need to put this Agenda 2063 in proper historical perspective. It is not the first time Africa is starting long-term development planning. It will be extremely important to look at what went wrong and right in Lagos Plan of Action, in Abuja Treaty, and in the very recent one, NEPAD. Not looking at the entire structure of it, but zeroing in straight into the capacity development aspect of it. And here I would like to pick one or two issues. Both Lagos Plan of Action and Abuja Treaty came to being in a time when there was a prevalence of probably development planning in that era, which was led by the thinking that favored market-led approaches and less state involvement approaches. Some people could refer to SABs and all that, but I would like to think that era is very important in our history in the sense that we need to interrogate what was the role of the state in all those plans. Long-term development planning would require a very serious role and engagement of the state in terms of leadership, vision, commitment, a project for the society. So unless you get that, some might call it capable state, developmental state. Personally, I would like to prefer calling it democratic developmental state, with all its unpacked issues. The second point I want to address here, maybe just very briefly, we talk a lot about the transformation agenda of the continent without unpacking this transformation. It would be extremely important to look at the capacity requirement of the transformation agenda. When we talk about a reformed or transformed economy would favor pushing resources to more productive assets, productive sectors, moving from agriculture to industry, service sector, urbanization, and all this. What are the capacity requirements of that agenda of transformation? I think still this is an area we need to unpack. Third, the priority. We have to prioritize. I think you cannot do everything under the earth. And here I would like to think for a transformed Africa, I would like to think about maybe 5 areas. We need to bring back economic development planning in the continent, bring it back at the center of development planning, number one. Number two, a much more progressive developmental macroeconomic policy. Our central banks need to, it is fine for them to look at inflation and all these things, but they need also to bring the developmental perspective back into financing and all this. Third, the issue of probably statistics is key to all this. We all talked about it. Natural development management for development. This outdated model of dig and export in the continent, where you have a mine at a throw of a stone from a village that has no water, no this, no that. I'm not talking about the corporate social responsibility. This is paying lip service. We need to look at development, natural resource as an integral part of our development model. And then regional integration is key to all this. Probably as a cross-cutting issues, you need to look at gender, the role of women in productive sectors, whether it's agriculture, trade, and all that. Then governance as an enabling issue, and maybe climate change. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamdok. We'll come back and maybe also interrogate some of the points you've made. But Professor Nadozie, you cited that APEX organization that looks at building capacity on the African continent. Having heard what Mr. Nyambie has presented and scanning the continent from where you sit, Do we lack capacity in the continent? And also, I suppose, unpacking that whole capacity word is important, because some people say the continent that has contributed more professors than any other is Africa. So I don't know what that capacity is really about. So do we lack capacity, the continent, to get this continent moving?
You know, as the organizer, would rather listen than talk, because I've learned something in this world that it's a smart thing to hear other people so that you will be able to gain from their knowledge. But since you have put me on the spot, let me go ahead and respond. Depends on where you're looking, from where you stand. You know, there's such a thing as the illusion of lack of capacity. I think this is something that we have talked about with Hespina and the rest and everybody else when we were doing the strategic, the African Capacity Development Strategic Framework. That there are countries or regions or even areas where the problem is not lack of capacity. But readily what comes to people, the expression in French, on n'a pas le moyen, on va faire ça, on n'a pas le moyen. But if you look deeply, you'll see that you actually do have that capacity, but either they're not properly utilized or you're not able to retain them. And so you have to look at, but there are certain areas. I'll give you a very good example. I'm told, and I have to verify that Africa produces less than half of the engineers, it might even be worse than that, engineers that it needs on a yearly basis to be able to have a credible transformation agenda, that is to industrialize, truly. And if you are doing that, you are not able to, because engineering is at the center of industrialization. I know people use science and technology and all that, but look at every country. They paid attention more, starting from engineers, before you go to science and the rest of them, because you want people who know how to imitate, who can look at this something and say, let's produce it here in Africa. That's where everybody has started, and that's the kind of people you need. But if you are not able to produce the quantity of engineers at the right quality, and even the ones you produce, they're immigrating to somewhere else, you're not retaining them, then there is a serious capacity challenge that you face there. So if we can bring it down to that level to say that you need more than double the number of engineers you're producing, you need to actually improve the quality and then link them up with what is happening in the rest of the economy, with the private sector and everybody else, so that there will be no that kind of information asymmetry that is creating sometimes the illusion where you have maybe a country that has an abundance of supply of people who are good, and some other countries that do not have that, where you can bridge that gap. So for me, I will sum it up that we need a capacity revolution in the continent. And ACBF is standing up to say that we must bring about this capacity revolution, because the gaps in certain areas that are so critical, where the binding constraints are so severe that only a revolution will really change things. Our universities must educate for Africa's needs. And that is probably where we need to start this process. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we can clap much stronger than that. We've had breakfast. Co-Commissioner, I think you've heard Dr. Hamdok. You've also had Professor Nadozi, and he's talking about the revolution. Dr. Hamdok is talking about having a developmental way of doing things, and also transformational, almost coming together again in revolutionizing the way we think about capacity. My question to you would be, again, Dr. Hamdok mentioned the issue of, let's look at, this is not the first plan. At the AU, are you getting the sense that this one will work, this plan will work? And if you feel that this will work, why do we have those plans that haven't worked? And why are you excited about this? Well, what's new?
Je pense que la réponse est tout à fait aisée. Si l'homme abandonnait à sa première chute, l'espèce aurait disparu. Et un enfant devient un homme parce qu'il grandit. Il tombe, il se relève. Et c'est, je pense, Mandela qui a dû dire, le problème, ce n'est pas de tomber. C'est d'avoir le courage de se relever et de repartir. Chacun de nous doit d'abord bâtir sa propre confiance. C'est un élément important. C'est un élément important de bâtir la confiance. Et nous croyons en ce que nous faisons parce que nous pensons que la confiance que les Africains ont en eux-mêmes grandit également. On n'était pas au même niveau nécessairement il y a 60 ans. Donc il y a des progrès qui se réalisent. Nous parlons de changement de paradigme. Vous savez, j'ai visité un pays, le jeu n'est pas recommandable, mais j'ai visité un pays et la première chose qui m'a frappé, quand j'ai traversé le portail d'une université, sur un bâtiment, j'ai regardé écrit, et c'était la première fois que je vois cet élément exprimé de cette manière si simple. C'était marqué, ici, nous formons les créateurs d'emplois et pas des demandeurs d'emploi. Vous savez, c'est une chose qui, si chaque Africain peut intégrer cela dans son comportement, c'est ça la révolution. Ça, c'est déjà une révolution. Je parlais hier à mes frères en disant, nous parlons de l'enseignement professionnel et technique. Sous la conception que nous avons héritée, je peux dire, de la colonisation. Mais nous ne réalisons pas que pour avoir un avocat, pour avoir un médecin, pour avoir un ingénieur, c'est une formation professionnelle, mais de haut niveau. Et si nous concevons maintenant que l'enseignement technique, l'enseignement et la formation technique et professionnelle commencent depuis le primaire jusqu'à l'enseignement supérieur, vous vous rendrez compte qu'on ne va plus considérer que l'enseignement et la formation technique et professionnelle, c'est pour les élèves cancres, ceux qui ont échoué partout et qui doivent y aller. Non. Tout le monde va se rendre compte que non. La fin de l'école, c'est de trouver un métier, c'est de trouver un emploi. Et c'est donc une formation technique et professionnelle. Et c'est ça le problème sur lequel nous pensons que tout le débat que nous avons ici, qui est basé sur le fait que nous voulons changer le paradigme. Nous voulons faire une révolution qui part sur nous-mêmes. Voilà pourquoi nous avons confiance dans ce que nous faisons, parce que nous avons défini une mission. Nous avons défini une mission. Nous voulons préparer les hommes à qui nous allons confier cette mission. Quand je dis les hommes, c'est les humains. À ce niveau-là, quand je parle des hommes, c'est... Alors je reprends. Nous avons une mission. Nous voulons préparer, et cette réunion aujourd'hui, c'est pour préparer les hommes et les femmes capables de le faire. Et nous avons placé cette réunion à l'intérieur d'une autre réunion qui parle de l'ensemble des moyens. Et c'est ce que je disais tout à l'heure. Je suis très heureux de voir que lorsque le professeur Nandozi parle des capacités, c'est cet ensemble de capacités. C'est les hommes et les femmes, mais aussi tous les moyens qu'il y a derrière. Ça fait partie des capacités que nous devons définir. Alors nous sommes optimistes. Merci bien.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. The shackles of bondage of many African countries has been really, it's been over 50 years. And he is hoping that we're not looking also at another 50 years of falling and standing up, falling and standing up, and really not achieving anything. So it will depend, I suppose, on when we learn quickly and then get to really implement. But I'll ask more questions. Dr. Njeku, you've listened, you've heard. What's your thinking?
Let me take from where you just left. Well, of course, say thank you to ACBF and AUC, ECA for inviting me for this panel. Definitely, of course, this is an important process. Let's then think maybe of the paradigm, okay, as you are saying. the next 50 years, will we be falling and starting again and so on? Maybe I would basically say, is the next 50 years of Africa more like the last 50 years? Let's take the area where I work, regional integration or trade. Are we talking about an Africa that will be trading the same way that we have been doing, trading the same thing, or something else? My sense is that the last 50 years we have been talking about goods trade, but we are now increasingly thinking about facilitating the mobility, a knowledge-driven economy, whereby we would then really be looking more at policy integration and less so at goods integration. Then if I take it that way, I would also then say, can we say, let's assume that maybe the structure we had in place could have been the ones for that Africa, but maybe for the new Africa that we want, we might need a different set. Again, staying with regional integration, or the building blocks that we have, the relevant one for that Africa that we want in 50 years or the next 10 years. Which would then mean that when I would then ask the panel, the consultant, maybe also in addition to focusing on talking to the structures that we have now, also think out of the box. See if who else would come in, and then how would we get this going? As we are talking about capacity and again staying with regional integration, we know that there is an uneven progress on regional integration on the continent. Part of this is related to the institutional human capacity that we have, and some of the imbalance in human and institutional capacity that we have is also the way that capacity was funded. Okay, so then when we are talking about the next phase, how will we fund it? Will we have a case where we will fund the kind of capacity that Africa wants, or we would then go back to the same people who gave us the money to do the Africa that they wanted? Okay, so I think we need to ask those fundamental questions and then try to ask a question about what's the Africa that we are really talking about. To me, it should be a slightly different Africa. So we will then open the door for thinking differently and looking at a different set of stakeholders rather than the ones that we have.
Thank you very much, because it is the issue, and I think you're bringing an issue of funding here, and I think Dr. Hamdok asked of initiatives before, and I know that the issue of NEPAD was that when they started, I remember President Mbeki talking about that we need to make sure that we are self-sufficient, and some of these things are dead in the water because we might expect other people to fund the Africa we want, and it will turn out to be the Africa we do not want. Professor Ajay Kaye, your perspective also about the Africa we want and how it should look, and whether the capacities are already available or whether we need a certain way of looking at it. The Executive Secretary says that we need a revolution. You agree?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Let me again also thank the ACBF, the AUC, the ECA, not in order of any priority, so please forgive me for violating the protocol order, for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. Very quickly, my view is that what is different this time around is that attention is now being paid to a critical component of implementation. Africa and even African countries, they are not lacking in laws, in plans, in policies, but what is lacking is implementation. And one of the reasons, at least at the continental level, we have this, poor record of implementation is that we are very quick at putting up very nice ideas, signing off on them, and then when we return to the point of action, we start doing other things, even forgetting that we have already committed to some, very grandiose and very, inspiring ideas. So for this time around, to start thinking of this particular package, I think is something new, and I believe that being in the hands of very competent consultant like Professor Nyambi, I think we are well on our way. However, I heard in the presentation that in the second phase, we'll be talking about state-level capacity. My feeling is that should not be a second phase. It should be a kind of simultaneous, capacity development. Reason is that from all these projects that are listed, very nice projects, railway, aviation, and so on, there could be protocols at the continental level, but if the national level capacity to actually put these things in place are not there, it will be similar to talking like we have been talking. So I think which we have to pursue this agenda of capacity development at the national, regional, and continental level. So sequencing it and say we do continental and then later on we go to state, I think is, in my own judgment, likely to lead to very little achievement in the area of revolutionizing, capacity development that we have said. And it is also connected with what His Excellency, the Deputy Secretary said. We are talking about developmental state, and that means country. I don't think we can have developmental continent. All right, whether democratic or not, there can be no developmental continent. There cannot be developmental reg. Regional community. It is still the states that developmental ideas will have to be rooted. So I think I would like to plead that we take them together. It may require elaboration of the mandate of the distinguished consultants, but to say do this later come, I think we should not. Secondly, in the context of transformation, and I think Professor Njenku already alerted to it, we have ways of doing things that we have been doing. Are we talking about scaling it up or changing it? And my reading is that the desire is to change it, not to scale it up. And changing it means then that we should move away from producing and exporting or trading in crude materials in their crude state. This morning, last night, I was hearing on the TV, CNN, saying Ethiopia is the largest coffee producer in the world and also largest coffee consumer, and that the country is thinking of moving from about $70 billion to 1 trillion or something, in a few years, of exporting cocoa beans. I was a little bit disappointed. If at the continental level we are talking about transformation, and a member state is thinking of scaling up, production of coffee beans and exporting it, that to generate a lot of resources. I think that shows the reason why we should hone these things down at national level. I would have wanted to hear, okay, we are exporting this, we shall produce more of it, but process and beneficiate a lot of it so that we also join the league of Nescafe. And why are we not talking about Ethiopian cafe or something like that? As a vision, which brings the issue of focusing on it at the national level very, 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 very important. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I mean, Moderator, I think we should be thinking of, in the next 10 to 15 years, most African countries should graduate from largely low-income country, to largely middle and upper middle, as if possible, high income, countries. So we have to exit the low income, country, which means then the economy should be moving closer to being more knowledge driven. And to be knowledge driven, and that's why I think the consultants will need to help us in this regard. We need to emphasize, the knowledge production and utilization, which means certain, if you like, metrics of the African situation now, which is very low, in fact, absent in the area of patent registration, very low and absent in terms of scientific publications, very low in the area of quality of our universities, and it has been said by other colleagues that it's not just knowledge but skills. We need to scale up all of this because that is the foundation, and that's why in a 10-year scheme, the young ones of today, the 10s and the 12s, the 15s, are the one we need to quickly make sure we equip and kit to be able to play in that realm of a knowledge-driven economy that we're all aspiring to. Once that's in place, I think we shall be moving very far on the direction of building capacity for realizing the objective of Agenda 2063. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Olu. I just wanted to come back to you, Dr. Njike, and ask you, you mentioned about the structure of our organizations, be it at the regional level or also at the AU level. Do you see this dream, Agenda 2063, really taking off and get to being implemented with the structures that we have right now, be it at the regional level and at the AU?
I would even really say that we seem to be talking about the Africa of states, national level, regional level, continental level. We should really be talking about the Africa of the Africans, the people, not the people like the doctors, the real people who produce and who we want to help. So my sense is that we really need to break from that structure and then talk to the women in the street, have a panel like this where you get my sister who is selling at the market in Cocody or something like that, and then get their views on where we should be going. Because if not, we are likely not to really touch the real problem that people face on the ground.
Thank you. Dr. Hamdok, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, Daniel. And in addition to what Dominic has said, I think if you look at the structures of decision makings in the continent today, at the Pan-African level, sub-regional and country, there is what I could call a disconnect between what we approve, pronounce, whatever at the continental level and country level. We are very progressive at continental, coming up with all these kind of blueprints and plans and communiques and all that. But there is very little commitment in implementing them, following it through at the national level. And here I would like to allude to Professor Olu's point that this work will really fall or fly at the national level. So we need to take that into consideration, but also take issues of context. Yes, we are a continent that has by and large a lot of similarities and all that, but we have also our diversities. We need to maybe do some domestication, assimilation, whatever at national level for these continental blueprints and plans.
If I may follow up, how do you do that? Who should be leading that, Dr. Hamdok? Because if we have the AU and we have the AUC, and it dreams up this dream of Agenda 2063, does it force it on member states? Because also the relationship is rather odd. Maybe the people at the AUC need the member states to have their jobs, so who's the boss and who's not the boss, and who should follow what?
Well, I would like to believe here it's an issue of how do you look at development, generally speaking? If development becomes hegemonic, and probably, let us use whatever jargon in Gramscian sense or whatever, it becomes a society project. Transcend leaders and all that. And that is what, if we could have a developmental state, would have a society project that will, of course, last week we saw the world lost the great leader of Singapore, and these are the kind of things you want to do. Yes, you can mourn the leader who leaves and all that, but this whole thing will be internalized, and society takes it as a project.
I see. Some people would say be very careful, because once you start giving examples of Lee Kuan Yew, then you're talking about a dictator, and some would call him a benevolent dictator. But yes, he got something going. I just want to open the floor. If there is anyone who needs to direct a question to our panelists, please get ready. I see their hands already, and they're all from men, so I would want to see women too. Oh, I see two ladies now. I see two ladies. Yeah, we're talking youth. Yes, 51, I think they say. Yes. So I'll start with you, ma'am, and then I'll come to you, sir, and I'll come to you, ma'am.
My name is Muila Chikaga. I'm the Regional Gender Specialist for the International Labour Organization. Samuel, thank you very much for your presentation. Not surprisingly, I want to address the issue of how you are approaching the capacity deficiencies of women. When you were making your presentation, I was intrigued by this statement. You said, making Agenda 2063 work for women. I think I understand where you're coming from, and I think you are in the right place. If I understand you correctly, you are very conscious of the fact that due to historical patriarchy and discrimination, women have been disadvantaged in terms of acquisition of, capacity. But then earlier on, we also sort of warned ourselves to bear in mind what went wrong. And in my view, in the past, what went wrong was the women in development approach. Let me explain what I mean by this. Let's use a train. We have a development train rolling. It's in full speed. And then we look outside the window and say, there are the women. They are our women. We need to take them along. So the way you've put this making Agenda 2063 work for women is that women are recipients of charity. And this is where I'm saying I think we need to relook at this approach, because I think we all know that actually women are productive agents. And I think this is the approach we should take. Just take the issue of agriculture in Africa, and I think you will see the need for us to have a different approach. And I strongly urge that we move away from this women in development approach and look at the gender equality approach. This will save us well. Thank you.
I don't have a question. I have two comments to make.
Okay.
The first is, I think...
Maybe one point, because we want to give other people a chance. So one, and then we will come back again.
Okay. Well, the fundamental issue I want to raise has to do with our higher education system. There's a lot of emphasis, reference to it somehow, talking about capacity, training, knowledge production. It happens at the universities, and the African universities have serious capacity problems, particularly at the staffing level. There's an acute shortage of qualified teaching staff in many universities on this continent. And it's an issue that has to be addressed if you want to address the capacity need of the continent. And it's not all about employability. There are sectors of this, they are unemployed accountants, unemployed computer specialists, unemployed architects, unemployed engineers. You find them on this continent. Unemployed doctors.
So there's a shortage. What do we do?
No, it should be addressed. I think the issue of higher education should be at the center of this reflection on capacity development of this continent. Higher education and research and knowledge production. That should be central. It has been addressed in a very peripheral way. We've had a higher education summit in Dakar 10 days ago with a declaration and a set of issues that have been addressed. I think we should link the discussions that we're having on the continent.
Thank you very much. Ma'am.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm not going to be very long, but just one. I think you raised important questions around the...
Oh, sorry, ma'am.
Oh.
You didn't identify
sorry.
yourself.
I'm sorry.
Is it a question or is it a...
More of a comment.
A comment,
Yes,
you are
okay.
right.
My name is Nandi Mkungwana. I'm from the National Treasury of South Africa. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Okay. I think what's going to be critical with the Agenda 2063, I think I was making a statement,
Yes.
following up on the question that you made to the panel. That is what has happened in the past, and what we don't do as the continent is to look back and say, what lessons have we learned from the past plans, So much has happened, but nothing has, so much has been said, but nothing has, or very little has happened. I mean, we can cite examples like the one that the panel was were raising on this issue. So one is national development plans that can be implemented. And critical amongst these is going to be the ability of member states to be able to raise domestic resources.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't need to wait for someone to come to our rescue. We have developed an Agenda 2063 which will need to be set up into what is it that as governments we want to do. Prioritize is the most important thing. What can you do with the resources you have? Domestic resource mobilization. Where can we, as the country, or what can we do with the resources we have, and where can we, or how can we raise our resources? And critical amongst in that shortly is the role of the capacity building institutions. They will need to be more focused and use their comparative advantage. What is it that they can do as capacity to assist member states to develop these plans, to prioritize, to use the resources available, and to mobilize the resources that they can within their countries. And lastly, Chair, is a more coordinated approach. I think the presenter made that very clear, that the capacity building organizations that we have will need to work together.